Right.
We should be
Okay, good. All right. So the research question that I started with was how to mobilize people in poverty in Nebraska. So that just kind of led to understanding what poverty was, how is poverty different in Nebraska than other states, then what is mobilization, what does community organizing look like, and then what groups are affected by mobilizing and how did they do it. So before I do that, I want to just introduce myself a little bit. My name is Packy. I found out within this last week that I was named after an elephant, and it is this elephant. It was the first elephant born in the Western Hemisphere, and is currently the oldest elephant in the Western Hemisphere at this time. He lives in Eugene, Oregon.
Can I ask, why you only found that out this week?
Because I just kind of asked my parents, and I was on vacation with them this week, and then I just said, where did that come from? It's a bizarre name. And they just said, well, you were named after an elephant. And so it just, first time.
Pachyderm.
Yeah, Pachyderm. Packy the elephant.
Is Packy your full name?
Yeah.
Pachyderm your full name?
Packy. Packy is my full name with my 3 middle names to go with it. So, so I've been a volunteer and intern here at Appleseed, and most of you know me by now. I'm earning my Bachelor's of Science in Economics with a minor in Mathematics and Data Science, and then I am getting a Bachelor's in Social Work with a minor in Computer Science. So that's my educational background. I'm finishing on my last year. I'll graduate in May with both those degrees, and I finished my social work degree actually as of today. So, professional experience, I was the Operations Director of Care for Homeless Services. I was a volunteer organizer with Heartland Worker Center. I was the social work advocate for the Nebraska Broadband Initiative. And then I was a lead researcher at Teddy Bear Hollow, where I did program evaluation. And so we'll start talking about poverty measures. And what is poverty and how is it defined in the United States? So there's 3 main strategies to defining poverty. There are relative poverty, so that means comparing groups to other groups within a certain geographic area. So this group is poorer than that group, so that's what poverty is. Absolute measures of poverty, which are based on inability to access a resource. So this person cannot afford food, therefore they are in poverty, opposed to comparing. Because with a relative measure, it is possible that people are living very comfortably, but they're still in poverty just due to a percentage or some other measure. And then lastly, and this is more controversial and it just became more popular throughout the 80s and now is being looked at much more seriously, is poverty as a culture, where poverty is a lifestyle and poverty is more or less a choice, which with that comes lots of controversy. So I don't talk about that as much in this presentation. So the federal poverty level is defined as 3 times the minimum amount of the average food price for a household in the year 1963, adjusted for inflation using the Consumer Price Index. It was formerly known as the poverty line. They officially switched it to poverty level in 2012, I believe it was. The Consumer Price Index is collected by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is part of the Office of Economic Activity, which is part of the Department of Commerce. And then the federal poverty level is reported by the Department of Health and Human Services. So that's how that's collected, but there's a lot of different agencies involved and there's always room for data collection errors, and that can be seen somewhat, but ultimately this is the best measure for poverty we use. Yeah.
I know that. So there was a West Wing episode about this, about how they determined what poverty is, and it was based on food prices because that was the most expensive item in a family's budget back in the 1960s, but now it would seem that housing or potentially transportation would be a bigger.
What a great question, because it will be addressed in a future slide.
Okay.
So that's what the federal poverty level currently is, and I'll talk about the supplemental measure, which addresses that issue more in depth. So what the national poverty rate or official poverty measure is reported by the census. So this is percentage of non-elderly individuals living below the federal poverty line. So important distinctions is the federal poverty level is determined by households instead of individuals. So it counts the individuals within those households for the percentage. So it does individual over population over households versus number of households. If that makes sense. Also, it doesn't include elderly individuals in its calculation. So it just determines the elderly population as not part of it. This is collected by the Census Bureau. And then we'll talk about the supplemental poverty measure. This was just added to the census in the 2010 census, and it uses what is called FCUS as its measurement system. So that's the cost of food, clothing, utilities, and shelter. So it uses that as the base price. And why that was added in is that in the CPI, food has remained constant with the overall CPI's inflation, but housing is raising much faster than the CPI's current rate of inflation. And because of that, they want to move to this FCUS measurement opposed to using 3 times the price of food in 1963. However, this doesn't account for transportation, it doesn't account for internet access, using a cell phone, any of those things. And they want to do 1.2 times the FCUS, so of people in the 30 to 36 percentile. So they take the average of people in 30 to 36 percentile for what they pay on food, clothing, utilities, and shelter, and times that by 1.2. And that is the threshold for the supplemental poverty measure. But the issue with both of these measures is they usually come through the American Community Survey, which you have self-reported income. And especially if you're working multiple jobs or doing something like that, it's hard to know your income just off of a quick survey. I mean, I don't think most people could just say off the top of their head what their salary has been for a whole year. And because of that, that's an issue with collecting the data there. And they send out 3 million surveys annually. And as I mentioned earlier, the incomes are self-reported. And the population of the US is about 321 million, so you're only reaching a little less than 1%, even if everyone responds. Of course, this is a big deal, but I'll talk about some issues that came up specifically with Nebraska's data regarding the American Community Survey in just a moment. So, differences in Nebraska and what makes poverty unique here. So the main takeaways I got from the key differences for Nebraska is we have slightly lower averages regardless of the depth of poverty. So depth of poverty refers to how far below the poverty line they are. So 50% of the poverty line, 50 to 76, and then 76 to 100, 100 to 124. So those are the 4 main depths measured for poverty. And depth of poverty is actually collected by the University of Wisconsin, a non-government institution, and their Center for Research on Poverty is who collects it. It's not a government institution, not anything. I mean, University of Wisconsin is government, but less directly. There's very blatant underreporting of poverty in Nebraska, and this was found by looking at food stamp qualifications and other data we'll look at. And then I looked at Nebraska has high amounts of assets given its states, and I looked at that through 3 different ways, and I'll show you how I did that specifically here in just a moment. So national versus Nebraska. So Nebraska has 5.5% poverty rate for under 50% of the poverty line versus the national of 7%, and then 7.7 versus 8.8 for people between 50 and 100% of the poverty line. When doing a t-test, the p-value for both of those were 0.001 and 0.005, saying that this is a significant difference than the rest of the country. However, for 100 to 124% is the exact same, which, as you can tell, is not a significant difference. And it's on pace with the rest of the country between 100 and 124%. Right now, Nebraska has the 16th lowest poverty rate for all measures. So Nebraska is very much on par with the country and doing much better as poverty rates themselves go. But an issue arose. In the 2014 American Community Survey, 4 counties reported no poverty whatsoever in their survey. So Cass, Adams, Grant, and Sioux County reported a 0% poverty rate.
Meaning not a single person in their county
no one
was at
or
poverty line or below.
Correct. So no one had, right. Even though they had individuals using food stamps, even though they had other things going on that were indicators of being in poverty, receiving Medicaid, looked at all these things. So I said, something is wrong here. So I looked into the methodology of the American Community Survey, and those were estimates based off all the years past. And I think it was Adams County has never had a person receive the American Community Survey in the history of the survey, which started in 2000.
That's Hastings.
Yeah, that's Hastings. So because of that, there was obvious reporting issues with this level. And then these other counties, these were just estimations based on it. But in the 2015 survey, this got addressed, and now they have poverty rates around 4 to 6%, which is still much lower than the rest of Nebraska, which is about 16% overall. But still there's issues there with the data, and there's missing data there. Again, now with asset wealth, measuring wealth is a very difficult thing to do. So I looked at it through a couple different ways. I looked at banking assets, which is where land and farm ownership assets are classified under. And Nebraska has $25 billion in banking assets, and per capita, it's the wealthiest state in this sense. There's no state wealthier based on population. And overall, it's ranked 9th, given that like there's New York and California that have these ridiculously large populations. That's really a significant amount of wealth that exists in Nebraska. And then how I decided to measure wealth was number of Pell Grant recipients, because Pell Grant recipients look at how much ownership you have over estates, land, property, things like that. I divided that by the number of students per the adult population. So that would find the average Pell Grant per number of students per the population of that county. And I divided all of that by the net income of the county. So to compare how much wealth there was versus how much income. And then I compared each county to every single other county in the United States. And so with this, I ran a t-test, so that's a comparison of means and a comparison to figure out how significant the difference is. So compared to Nebraska counties to all US counties, it was a significant difference. The p-value reported was a 0.002. That means very significant amount of people with wealth versus divided by the total number of assets. So that's just a ratio there. And then I wanted to see if there was rural disparities in Nebraska. So I took out the counties of Lancaster, Douglas, Sarpy, Dodge, Saunders, and there was a sixth one, I think it was Cass. Took those counties and compared them to the remainder of Nebraska. And then there was an even further significance with the amount of wealth in the rural counties. But this wealth is determined primarily by land use. So a lot of the people who live on acreages, that's considered a large amount of wealth, even though there's low incomes attached to that. So the example is, even though a farm owner is making about the same as a farmhand, the farm owner is considered much wealthier because of the amount of land they have. And this is a unique issue to Nebraska, and only other state when I was just playing around, I didn't check all 50 states, was Wyoming. Was the only one that I found anything similar to it existing. So I guess this is a very specifically rural issue. Community organizing theory, what is mobilization, how have other people looked at it? I started off with this reviewing the Journal of Community Organization and Social Mobilization. I thought that was a good place to start. So I started looking through their articles, and they haven't had anything published or produced since 2008 specifically about organizing or mobilizing, and they had nothing reported about mobilizing individuals in poverty. So there was a huge gap in literature. I couldn't find any specific information. So I resorted to old organizing theories that were either related to different populations or different groups or just organizing in general. So there were three theories that I thought were the most pertinent to organizing poverty in Nebraska. So the first one is the ecological model. This was introduced by Brockenbrenner, who is a child psychologist. This model always focuses on the individual, which in this case was always the child, and has 5 systems that affect the child. The microsystem, which are the people the child individually interacts with. The mesosystem, which are all the people who interact with who he interacts. So like his teacher meeting with a parent. That would be a mesosystem interaction. Exosystem are like policies at his parent's workplace, rules of the church he attends, things like that. And then there's the macro system, which are attitudes and beliefs, state and national laws, those type of things. And then it marks the interaction between each of these systems and how they work. The last system I didn't mention is what's called the chronosystem, is how this individual changes over time and those things. One of the issues with this model for organizing those is very much individual focused, and all of the macro issues seem secondary to how it affects the individual. And because of that, I wanted to look at the general systems theory. General systems theory was actually developed in physics, and is the model here on the left is what the physicists developed, which is about analyzing how an individual is interacting with something or how something is interacting with something, design a way to make it work, develop that individual, and then implement a strategy to affect it. Social sciences then started to take this model and adjust it to this model that's closer to the bottom left here, which is you have an input, goes into the system, then a new output is created by it, which then affects its surroundings. And each of these systems are supposed to have very clear boundaries. So that could be individuals have boundaries. It could be Appleseed as an organization is a separate organization than say like the Heartland Worker Center or it could be physical boundaries, and how all these boundaries interact with each other. It also introduced a concept of entropy. That means a system has closed down entirely. There's no way you can put anything into the system or out of the system. On a much smaller scale, this refers to households with abuse, or this could refer to extreme policy measures like in Nazi Germany or things like that. So that would be a closed system where input doesn't matter and it's not creating an output anymore. One or both of those things. Lastly, I wanted to look at empowerment theory. Empowerment theory for organization was defined as an intentional ongoing process centered in the local community involving mutual respect, critical reflection, caring, and group participation, through which people lacking an equal share of resource gain greater access to and over those resources. So this started becoming more common in literature in the late 80s, and then is one of the fundamental tenets of social work in the American Counseling Association's Code of Ethics. It's a very much well-known theory in the sense of case-by-case work, but it isn't used too much in community organization, although there are some organizers who claim to use empowerment theory. One of the main issues with empowerment theory is stigmas attached to a population. So empowerment theory is really well used in organizing for racial use. So a lot of times, like with the driver's licenses for Dreamers Act, something like that, where being proud of your race was important, where being proud of poverty isn't as much existent. And because of the stigma attached to it, empowerment theory struggles in that realm. And I think it was important to draw that disconnect there. Also, and related to working with poverty is the concept of learned helplessness, where nothing has worked in the past, why should I keep trying new efforts and making things work? And so that kind of related to empowerment theory, where it comes back to finding something that actualizes the self and makes them excited about what they're doing, or that change is even possible. That can go back to entropy, where they don't think change is possible, or maybe that is a true existence that happens. So those were the three main organizing theories I sought out and I thought were most relevant to empowering individuals in poverty. So lastly, case studies. I looked up 6 different organizations that have all worked specifically with poverty or groups that were considered marginalized in some sort. A lot of them are fairly historical, some are more modern. It just kind of runs the gambit. So I started with the settlement house movement, which started in New York, but moved to other cities like Chicago. And this was popular from 1880 to 1920, so definitely an older time. This was a live-in movement, so that meant that all the people who were organizing and trying to develop these systems were living in the community they were trying to help. So they moved to poor areas of New York, poor areas of Chicago. They provided daycare, healthcare, cultural classes, these type of things, all voluntarily, just to try to get a sense of community developed. So, but this movement was so successful because the absolute poverty was much worse in 1880 than it is today. And a movement like this probably wouldn't be as successful today because of the significant difference in absolute poverty. But what was a big good takeaway from it is that they became part of the community and really listened to their needs. On a similar vein as the Charity Organization Society, originated in London, spread to the US with immigration, was popular at the same time as the settlement house movement. But what was different from this movement is that they would visit the neighborhoods opposed to live in them and then ask individual people what they needed. I liken this a lot to our intake line that we have here at Appleseed, where it's individual people saying, I need help with this, what can we do? And then they turn that into an organized movement. So that's what the Charity Organization Society did. It's still around today, and it's all been rebranded as the United Way, so that's where it is now. The United Services Organization. I thought this one was interesting because it sought out partnering with people that you typically don't partner with. So it started with World War II, and it's the only officially chartered by the U.S. government organization that is not a U.S. government organization. So it's chartered by the U.S. government to work and do its work, but it is not a government organization. It was at its height during the Vietnam War. It's still active today. So what it did was it partnered with the entertainment industry and partnered with primarily the entertainment industry to make videos about the harsh conditions of living overseas, of doing anything within the war. And they are contracted through the Department of Defense, is who they're contracted through. And then they started doing morale building things with soldiers and veterans to have concerts overseas, have concerts for different things. But why it was interesting is, especially during the Vietnam War, being in the military wasn't always looked as a positive thing. And because of that, that's why they had to partner with the entertainment industry. There's actually a great video that came out right before the Vietnam War that Ronald Reagan was actually in. He was an actor exaggerating the circumstances of being in war, where everyone was desperate for showers and everyone was fighting over chairs, and it was just this exaggerated thing. It's been, you can find it on YouTube, but it's been no longer an official USO video. And so I thought it was interesting because they partnered with entertainment industry and other individuals opposed to the actual individuals affected or politicians. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, this got very popular around the Great Depression. It is now known as the AFL-CIO, which is a very powerful organization today. Originated in Chicago, and it was focused on unifying different low-wage professions. So they were looking for managers of low-wage professions, looking for all sorts of individuals who were in a similar type of manual work and getting them to work together and finding out common goals. So one of their big things was living wage advocacy, which they ultimately did through collective bargaining measures. And they're considered one of the biggest collective bargaining measures to this day. One of the main advocates for setting a minimum wage in the 1930s. And that was done through sit-ins, strikes, typical organizing things that were more common back in this time period. Lastly, no, there's two more organizations. ACORN, which is the Association of Community Organization Reform Now. I would liken it very much to our organization, where it had a team of lawyers and a team of organizers that worked together to address issues. Started in 1970, it ended in 1910. It was based in New Orleans, and that was largely a result of Katrina. The needs of the community just changed dramatically because of that, so they ended up being discontinued in 2010. So they believed in poverty advocacy through direct contact. So one of their big strategies that I found very interesting was that they would go to hospital emergency rooms, and I started doing this in the 80s, and just asking people, why are you here? What can we do to help? Can you find preventative care here? What can we do to what's your insurance status? And so they were sitting in waiting rooms. Was essentially their organization strategy. And as a result of it, they got Medicaid programming expanded before it was even an issue in the 90s. So they had up to 150% of their poverty line was covered through Medicaid, which was no one did. And they also ignored groups, I believe. I'm not certain on that last point. But that was one of their big successes and an interesting story. And ACORN had multiple chapters across the U.S., but the New Orleans chapter was their most prominent.
Did they continue to organize in that way up until 2010, or did their tactics change between the 90s and 2000s?
I'm not sure on the specific history, but I know for sure they continued doing tactics where they would go directly to neighborhoods and community things and asking individuals up through 2010, or at least through 2005, because from 2005 on, they went for a more macro-focused approach opposed to a grassroots approach. I don't know specifically if they did this for all. They worked on many issues, not just poverty, but I know they did that for child welfare, as they would go to child welfare organizations and work with specific children and help out with that. I know they did that effort. So maybe, I can't say confidently for sure.
It's an interesting thought around Medicaid expansion.
Maybe that's what
Yeah.
I should do.
And I don't know, it'd be interesting to know how they approached it
Yeah.
exactly, because how you walk up to someone in an emergency room and ask them,
Yeah.
what do you, it's a personal question
Right.
by its nature.
Right.
But that's an interesting thought.
Yeah. I think coming from a strategy of being conversational and being supportive, and I think it goes back to a lot of the earlier movements where it was, how can we help you? And using our intake line and things like that. But this was a fairly modern strategy, and this is a modern organization, so I was very intrigued by it. Lastly is the Gamaliel Foundation, which is still in existence today. Obama worked at the Gamaliel Foundation when he was an organizer in Chicago. It was started by Saul Alinsky. Gamaliel was a biblical organizer who helped St. Paul. But originating in Chicago, it unified 10,000 different faith-based organizations. So they went all different religious denominations, but they did everything through faith-based. So I would liken it to an organization similar to OTOC, but it was ultimately reaching people through community centers, reaching them through their faith organizations, opposed to directly to them. And so a lot of the faith leaders became the organizers, opposed to reaching the people themselves, where the faith leaders would then organize their people to do all sorts of events. And I just thought that was an interesting approach, using something that's already established and just unifying it. Those were the 6 organizations I looked at. Is there anything that you had specific questions on, or anything that you took away from this presentation or want to discuss further that maybe I could help you understand if something was unclear? Anything I can help with?
This was not in there, so it's fine if you didn't look at it, but I was curious about something like Occupy Wall Street that had a very decentralized structure and kind of a seemingly leaderless in a sense, which in my opinion was part of its demise. But although I know it still exists. Did you happen to look at that group at all?
We looked at 2 groups that are kind of in that vein. So I looked at Occupy Wall Street specifically, the Arab Spring, and then the Black Lives Matter movement. And the issue with that is they were all leaderless movements. They were all quick, and they were all born on Twitter. And because of that, it's really hard to study it, because no one really is. As I mentioned earlier, there wasn't really anything written since 2008 about organizing. And that was part of my thought, is that organizing shifted so much with the advent of social media, and especially Twitter's popularity. And I feel like that's where those movements were born, was out of just a general frustration, and anyone had access to it.
And a catalyzing event.
Yeah, yeah. So I think it's interesting, and it's definitely something I want to look more into, but it's just hard to, because no one else has really done work on it that I could build off of a report or add to. Someone has to be looking at it. And I think that's really where the future of organizing is going and mobilizing individuals. But again, you mentioned it was leaderless, and that was part of its demise, and I think that's what happened with the Arab Spring once the issue was over, the organization's gone. With Occupy Wall Street, which is still somewhat around, they lost it. And Black Lives Matter, every time a new event happens, they get reinvigorated, but they kind of die off for a moment. But they did just recently write an official platform, which is an important thing, and I think that's good, and they're trying to show leadership, which is a thing that they probably realized wasn't successful about the Arab Spring movement and Occupy Wall Street.
Sounds like a good master's paper.
It does.
No, this is like exactly what I want to study in grad school, but you just did it. So.
But that was a great question, and that was something I actually talked to the professor I was working with on this project the most. That was something that we were trying to figure out, is like, why does all the literature stop in 2008? I think it's because people are afraid of talking about communication networks in the context of social justice. And I think IT people are oftentimes afraid to touch on social justice issues, and social justice people are afraid to talk about communication networks and technology infrastructure and those type of things. So I think once these 2 worlds start to get closer to each other, we'll have a lot of interesting information there.
Well, it sounds a lot like a progressive technology project. So, are you familiar at all with PTP?
I have heard of it, but I can't say more than that.
Because they hold like workshops for organizations like Appleseed. I know I've been to a couple where they try to help you use technology, social media, and digital communications in your organization.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's definitely something I would want to look into more. But yeah, because that was something that came up with the Nebraska Broadband Initiative when I worked with them. Was one of the reasons we can't mobilize rural populations was because they're not able to communicate with everyone else easily, because that could be due to internet access, even phone access. Cell phones don't work in much of western Nebraska. So those issues came up where these people want to do things, they want to be involved in their state and their national politics and all those things. So they're just not able to due to infrastructural issues. So that's related vaguely, but in the same vein. And I think, especially in Nebraska, that's what makes us unique.
Well, you and I talked about this a little bit, but what would be your main takeaways for us as an organization from what you've learned?
I
know that's hard.
Yeah. There were a lot of different things that came out of this, and I think what's important to look at is how much resources we have. Like, again, with that asset portion of Nebraska, we have lots of building spaces available, lots of vacated building, lots of buildings that aren't used after 5 o'clock. So utilizing those spaces to be somewhat of a community center, especially in rural areas. I know that when I drive on Highway 6 back here, I go past 3 different Wild Willie fireworks stands, which are entirely closed for almost entire year, but that building just sits there. Which, I mean, those can maybe become community centers, especially when it comes to rural activism. And I think the rural issue and the poverty issue go a lot hand in hand, especially in Nebraska. Getting that all connected, I think, was my big
think a
takeaway.
space for organizing is the big challenge in rural areas, like just having a building for people to meet at?
I think that is an issue, but I don't know what the main issue is. I think that is one. That makes sense. A space where people can connect. I mean, I think digitally there have been options for that, and I think those have been very good, but I think there is just something that adds extra emphasis when you're at an in-person meeting versus getting a newsletter and responding to a forum or something like that. And I think it makes the assembly more deliberative, if that makes sense.
What about in terms of, I know with empowerment theory, you said that the challenge with poverty as opposed to racial organizing is stigma.
Mhm.
This is a big question for anyone, but how could we better organize low income people?
I think coming from the position of this will make things better helps a lot of times, because I think a lot of times when individuals think of any sort of political activism, they think that they need to be some sort of hero, or it's going to be lots of effort, or a lot of work is attached to it, and then I have to be all over and I'll become a face and all of these things, where it doesn't need to be that per se. So I think the point is just saying, hey, we want to make things better for you and our society as a whole. This is how we can work together on this. And that's why I really like the intake line that we have here at Appleseed. That was something that I think it would be very helpful in that. And I don't know if it has been or not, but I think that's a good place to start going with that. So it does destigmatize, and it does also makes our goals work as well.
Did you find any, I mean, sort of it's directly connected to what Kate just asked. Did you find any organization that tried and failed or tried and succeeded in mobilizing around poverty itself? Because it's, as you said, it's usually connected to, this is an immigration issue, which is there's pride in race and ethnicity. It's an LGBT issue. Similarly, there can be there's a pride there where poverty is stigmatized and viewed as a moral failing. I think people don't want to admit it because for whatever reason, that's the way our country views
The myth
poverty.
of meritocracy.
And
Or
so
you screwed up.
I have been really interested in, is there any way, I think that view has to be disrupted, that it's not a moral failing, it's a structural problem.
Right.
And I don't know how you get that through. How do you get that? I mean, it's sort of it's a cultural shift.
I think one of the things is one of the big booms in the LGBT movement and gaining acceptance and stuff was realizing that it was born that way. I think when it shifted from LGBT issues seemingly to be a choice versus something that was biological or something inherent was one of the big things, where it's just, you can't, it's unchangeable. There's no way to fix the fact that LGBT people are LGBT people. And part of that was, it was also being an ally-led movement. And then I think in recent years it's switched much more from being an ally-led movement to people within it movement. And especially in trans acceptance, I think it's currently making that shift from being an ally-led movement to a trans-led movement. Because that was something I looked at specifically because there was a shift in LGBT movement for it being something that was stigmatized to being something that could be prideful. Is there still stigma attached to the LGBT population? Of course there is. But I think there was a shift made. And I think one of the things that is benefiting is that we're realizing that income mobilization in poverty is something you're born into. It's very difficult to work yourself out of poverty. I think as we're getting more information and more data on that, that'll become forefront. It's slow, but I think it will get there. I think when we realize that poverty is something that is structural, that is something you're born into, that is something that is very difficult to get out of, that will change. But I do think it needs to, like the other movements of stigmatized populations, start as ally-led and then eventually shift into led by the people directly affected.
Even this, go.
I was just going to say that's an interesting way of thinking about it. Like, poverty is not a choice. Like, that is, because that's the issue. That's what people, if it's a moral failing, it's your choice. You're choosing to morally fail versus it actually is not a choice. You don't have.
And it's harder when you talk about poverty because there is the self-determinate aspect of it is the most visible and the most obvious. So like it's not entirely equitable with the LGBT and immigrant issues because there is there's always anecdotal stuff of like, I have a buddy who was born, his parents didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, and now he's like runs a Fortune 500 company. And if he did it, why can't you? So like those stories are out there, but I think we sort of come at it the right way. So you're talking about equality maybe isn't the realistic goal, but equal opportunity is. When you say like these people are working their tails off to get out of poverty, but like they've got X, Y, and Z structural barriers, we need to move those out of the way so that like if you want to say hard work solves everything, then the opportunity is there.
And I guess I'm thinking on a grassroots scale. Like I don't know if it plays to say, as you're saying, if we're messaging something to a broad audience, the legislature, that poverty isn't a choice. But if you're in a room full of people and you're saying, did you choose to be poor? Did you make that? Did you make that decision? Of course you didn't. Did you? No, you didn't either. But the problem with that is they'll say, I'm not poor. It's like, well, it's sort of getting to that place to say, let's be real here. Yeah. You're all fucking poor in here. That's the way it is.
Yeah,
and why is
policy recall?
Yeah.
In like 3 minutes, but I just want to like throw something out. But I kind of feel like maybe you shouldn't organize around poverty, right? And it has to be other things. Like if you think of like unions organizing around the work and what you're doing, and I know the goals are different there, but like even if you think of like I keep thinking about what NeighborWorks is doing, and I don't know a ton about it, but I'm learning more about sort of what their model is, and I feel like it's a lot of just like building up like local, like super local, like neighborhoods to be able to like accomplish something together and identify problems in their community. But it's not like they're going in saying, well, we know this neighborhood is poor, so we want to organize on poverty. I think you have to find those other things that bring people together, whether it's like a place or like maybe it's a larger identity of like the town they live in and why they care about it, or like, I don't know. I just feel like there's got to be something else because you're right. You're always going to have the pushback, even from people in poverty, of like, well, I'm not poor, or like, I don't want to identify as that. And maybe we shouldn't be asking people to identify that way.
This is the discussion we've been having for
But
a few
I just have
years.
to like throw that out there.
No, I know. I think that's going. I think what you're saying, is likely the most effective way of, because you want to grab a hold. I live in this community. There's pride in that. But what I'm keep asking myself is, will we ever get over this poverty as a moral failing until we confront it directly to say, yeah, it's a problem in your community, it's a problem in yours, it's a problem everywhere, and there's a reason for it, and it's not because of that. That's what, do we ever get beyond that if we don't call it what it is?
I feel like my most effective spokesperson meetings too are the ones where we start off by everyone sharing like what brought them there, which usually is, I don't have health insurance, and then that becomes a conversation of like, I also don't have food stamps and I can't afford to go back to school and need to, or something like that. And then from there, in an ideal meeting, which is what happened with the Omaha meeting last week, which I think is what energized people so much, it's a conversation of like, why did this happen? Like, how did we get to this point? And then I like talk about, here's like the policies that are in place that are keeping things from happening, right? And then people are like, what can we do about it? And so I think that like in a communal setting, there is a way for people to like, at least in that small group, feel some pride, or not even pride, but feel some like acceptance of like, I'm in poverty. But like broader,
The
like
deck
I
is
think,
stacked against.
yeah, exactly. But outside of that, I don't know that like it's harder for that to then turn away to like the broader public and say like, I'm poor and it's not my fault, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it feels to me like the empowerment and the acceptance comes through, like it's fixable, like it's becomes solutions focused almost. And I don't know, these are all just like threads and plug over my head. But like, well, being poor sucks. Let's fix it. We can acknowledge that. I mean, it not that the theory is the same, maybe, but not the circumstances. But like, you know, there's Alcoholics Anonymous meetings where people show up and like let their guard down and are humble and say, I'm an alcoholic. I want to fix it. Like, is there something in there that's similar where people are like, yeah, you know, my life hasn't turned out the way I wanted it to. I'm poor. What can we do to fix it? How can tomorrow be better than today?
Well, one last theory. I don't know if you saw acid-based community organizing at all. That's like a very Chicago-based sort of style of organizing that I think was what Obama was doing, kind of, that recognizes communities have assets and strengths and expertise, especially about their own community, but even beyond that, that people can organize with and around to try to, you know, get better opportunity. But even that, like outside of a confined space, like a neighborhood, I don't know how some of that applies to like working statewide more too. So I don't know. Good job, Packy.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for sharing.